Let us pray. Gracious God, to whom we must account for all our powers and privileges, guide the people of this nation in the election of a president and all those who will represent us, that by faithful administration and wise laws, the rights of all may be protected and our nation be enabled to fulfill your purposes. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Larry's talk this morning is Pastor Looks at the Election. Thank you, Larry, for your willingness to do this. We have copies available afterwards if you're interested, and Larry's talk is also being recorded. And I also want to call your attention to Jim Meiskin, who is speaking next Sunday here at Proclamation.
Not a risky thing to do, right?
Hard Sunday. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, Jim's got the hard Sunday next week, and that's a philosopher makes sense of the results, right?
Thank you for doing that. So, and I really do appreciate this opportunity to speak. I told the early service, I'm preaching on this too, and that's about 2,100 words. This is about 3,300 words. So I've got about 5,500 words that are about as carefully crafted as any as I've tried to do. So there will be no deviation, but this should take about 35 minutes and then we'll have time for questions and exchange afterwards. So as I often do, what I want to do is give you some autobiographical narrative as a person who grew up with a lifelong interest in politics, to share how I have come to feel about presidential elections, partially because I think elections are in many ways about feelings. I want to recall some of the key events in my lifetime in which, like the rest of us, I have witnessed or experienced the fractiousness of our day, and then describe how two documents that I have encountered in my biblical study and teaching have connected my faith and theology with this electoral history and have impacted my instincts for leading Westminster on the social and political front through the elections that have ranged from the 2004 Hanging Chad's election through our upcoming election with its highly unusual dynamics. I moved here in the fall of 2004, had actually participated in the Iowa caucuses, moved here and got to vote in Virginia. I don't think that was illegal to do both of those things, but it's been an interesting time in our political history, to say the least. It's not appropriate for me to make any kind of public endorsement. I wrote this presentation long before the current controversy over two major newspapers deciding not to do that this year. Rather, I've always been more interested in what leads people to vote for one candidate or one party over another than I am in judging that choice. And the only prediction I feel safe making is that on January 20th of next year, we will likely and hopefully inaugurate a new president, though what we go through between now and then is anyone's guess. So I was born in Jonesboro, Arkansas in 1955, but I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My parents each just had about 1 year of college, and with one exception, my grandparents did not have an education. Like many families in those days, we would drive from Memphis to Jonesboro about an hour and a half, about once a month to visit grandparents. And I remember as a child just the heavy anti-communist Red Scare atmosphere through which we drove. Billboards warning about communism, aluminum bomb shelters for sale at roadside places that might also sell headstones and mobile homes, as well as a red and black copy of a book called None Dare Call It Treason, one of the most influential tracks in the anti-communist movement, which was always on my grandmother's coffee table. My first memory of presidential elections was as a kindergartner in Memphis, hearing children chant anti-Kennedy slogans as they waited for the school bus at the corner. By contrast, I was in the third grade when the teacher was called to the principal's office and came back to tell us that President Kennedy had been killed, and our parents would soon arrive to pick us up. That was about 1:30 in the afternoon, as I recall. What I remember about that weekend and really the week follow was nothing but national mourning and grief over that assassination. I don't remember anything vengeful or celebratory, perhaps except over the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, which, as a harbinger of things to come, occurred on national television on Sunday morning. As it was for many of you, it was truly a week of unified, national, and respectful grief, as I remember it. My next memory was the 1964 election. My parents were strongly for Goldwater and thought he was going to win. When he lost, it seemed the darkest night in our house. Fears of government takeover, loss of control, capitulation to communism is what was voiced. At least in our household, I cannot remember much, if any, of that being directly racial in nature. As I've shared with you on numerous occasions, somewhere in the 1965 to 68 time period, as I noticed and witnessed the overt segregation around me, the drinking fountains, the restaurants, the public facilities, it brought forth from within me a child's sense that this is not right and that there has to be a better way. Going back to 1963, I had been somewhat aware, I was 8 years old then, of the Freedom Rides, the bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church, the German Shepherds and fire hoses, the March to Selma, the passage of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts, and ultimately President Johnson's decision in 1968 not to seek re-election. Followed shortly, you put this together and you forget how quickly all these happened, but followed shortly by the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. By then I was 13 and I watched the Democratic Convention in Chicago and the protests from which Hubert Humphrey emerged as the nominee. As I've said before, for some reason, the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement and the cultural changes that were represented by Woodstock, which happened the next year, were sort of over here for me. They just kind of passed me by. What moved my thinking and feelings about politics and elections was the civil rights movement. If we fast forward a few years, I was also impacted by Watergate, but again, not with the emotional fervor or feelings that I experienced about racial issues. I was in college by then. A church in East Memphis hired me for a summer job to run a gym that they had built. And I was mainly there just to supervise any teenagers or children who would come to the gym to shoot baskets during the day. The church had not been able to outfit the gym with any equipment other than basketballs, and they couldn't staff it with anything other than whatever it was they were paying me per hour. I don't remember, I doubt it was much. But my low pay was not disadvantageous, as I took advantage of the low numbers of people who showed up to shoot baskets by taking a small black and white TV to the gym and watching almost all of the Watergate hearings. I didn't have a lot of emotional connection to the presidential elections after Watergate. The first election in which I was eligible to vote was 1976. I was a first semester student at Union Seminary in New York that fall, and I voted absentee in Tennessee. For the next decade or so, as I entered seminary and then ministry, my interest shifted away from history, which I had majored in, towards biblical studies and theology. My secular interest shifted more from race to America's role in the world, prompted as much by the Iranian hostage crisis, President Carter's aborted rescue attempt, through the collapse of communism and the ending of the Cold War in 1989. Around 1987, when I was serving as a pastor in Houston, we seemed to enter an era in which a rancorous and nearly uncompromising spirit emerged within Congress that has pretty much remained with us today and has spread to all three branches of our government, as well as to our larger culture. The dates and events and the degree to which people followed them was doubtless influenced by the launch of CNN in the summer of 1980, which is when I was ordained. It really marked the beginning of what would become the televised and now online rancor, controversy and conflict, and the eventually performative approach that has come to dominate our politics, or at least the way we receive information about our politics through the various media in which we engage. Just think about this sequence of events, if you can remember them, most of them just 2 or 3 years apart. But in 1987, there were the Bork hearings. In 1989, there were the hearings around John Tower's nomination for Secretary of Defense, which probably wasn't huge nationally, but he was from the city that I had been ordained in, had taught college across the street from the church, and I was a family friend of a niece of his. So even though I was in Iowa at the time, I followed that a little bit more closely. So that was, 87 Bork hearings, 89, the Tower hearings, 1990, the Gulf War, 1991, the Clarence Thomas hearings, 1994, the contract with America, 1999, the impeachment of Bill Clinton, 2000, the hanging Chad's election, following a year later by 9/11. That was a lot to happen in about an 11 or 12 year period. When President Kennedy had been assassinated, Mary McGrory, the newspaper columnist, now deceased, had said to Patrick Moynihan, who at that time was a staffer, had not yet been elected senator. McGrory had said, "We will never laugh again," after JFK was shot. And Moynihan replied, "Mary, we will laugh again, but we will never be young again." I was actually told that story in a history class on modern history at the University of Arkansas, and have never forgotten it. Will never be young again. I don't know if it's my own passage from being young to being not so young, or the nature of our politics, or more likely a combination of both. But I know that for me, neither Morning in America, Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow, nor even There's Not a Liberal America and a Conservative America, a Red America and a Blue America, but a United States of America, none of these really caught fire with me. I just haven't felt young about politics for a long time. Now, despite the fact that it is wonderful living here in the DC area, which I absolutely love, and knowing people who have firsthand knowledge, often in small doses that you're able or willing to share with me, knowledge of campaigns and candidates, of the House, the Senate, the defense establishment, of government relations, offices and practices, of major news outlets and think tanks, I have still not quite ever recovered the feeling, at least in politics, of being young again. Nonetheless, I remain fascinated by the complexity of politics, by the dedication and intelligence of most of the people I know, mainly from Westminster, many, in this room today, who work in politics or journalism or think tanks or the military, defense establishment. By the essential ethic of public service that most people have. One of the earliest and most meaningful things I attended was a retirement ceremony for Terry Grindstaff, and this was a dozen or so years ago. And just, he was a budget officer with, I know Mike was there with either EPA or somebody at the time he retired from, but just the ethic of public service that he was able to articulate was just very meaningful, for me to see. And I'm also, just love the basic love of our nation and the willingness of most people in the right circumstances to discuss and even work through our differences over political issues. This leaves me basically hopeful about the long-term prospects of our nation and world, but it does not leave me without illusions about how change comes slowly and often painfully, and is neither guaranteed by goodwill nor, I suppose, by the God whom I believe is active in mysterious ways in the world, including in our politics. So while I don't think we will fully arrive in my lifetime at who we could possibly be as a nation, I don't think we'll ever be young again. I tend not to think that we will collapse, but I could be wrong. All of this leads me to the second part of what I want to say, which is the way my biblical and theological interests and instincts intersect with my role as a pastor, who, because of the location of this church, has something like a mid-row view of politics, not a front-row view, but a mid-row view. I've essentially shared what I'm going to say now with you at an adult education series in the fall of 2019, and in one of the Old Testament lessons that I lead each year. I would entitle this part of the presentation "A Biblical Perspective on Government." The first thing to be said is that neither the Old nor New Testaments have a concept of the state, either in the Greek or modern sense that we have. In the Old Testament, there is no clear separation between civil and religious spheres of life, no separation of church and state. Yet there are attitudes and assessments of government within the pages of the Bible that I do believe can speak to us today. The initial form of leadership among the people of God consists of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And they lead a nation-forming people of Israel as they are nomads in search of a promised land for centuries. These are followed by Moses, a towering figure who is both liberator and lawgiver, and who dominates the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. When the people finally enter the land in the first part of Joshua, about 600 years after it is promised, things don't get fulfilled quickly. They are led by tribal warriors such as Joshua, and after they enter the land, it is the judges, essentially tribal leaders, who would lead a local tribe to a military victory, be proclaimed leader, but then fail in either faithfulness to God or military and political leadership, leading the cycle to start over again. But this short period of 200 years of genuinely failed leadership is not presented to us by the Bible as vaunted or exemplary, which is a relief because it is one of the most violent periods of the Bible. The theological assessment of this period that is presented in the concluding verse to the book of Judges, presented to us as readers, is that this is a time of anarchy, violence, failure, and do-it-yourself morality, not to be emulated nor responded to as if the Bible is saying, "Go, therefore, and do likewise." Our reading of Joshua and Judges is then rescued by the story of Ruth, which immediately follows, and in which she, a foreigner, a Moabitess, an outsider, embodies everything that the people of God are supposed to embody, but don't. In the midst of this failed and frustrating situation, the people of Israel cry for a king so that they can be like other nations. Their judge Samuel doesn't think this is a good idea. God doesn't think it's a good idea, but God tells Samuel, let them have their king. So even the monarchy, which is the most established form of political leadership in Israel's history, is created under a shadow. After a slow start under Saul, the monarchy accomplishes much in developing Israel as a nation under both David and Solomon. But David's sexual abuse, if not rape of Bathsheba, and his arranged death of her husband Uriah, who is a major commander of his, followed by Solomon's opulence, religious syncretism, and lack of a clear succession plan, lead the nation to divide north and south, Israel and Judah, and eventually to be conquered by their enemies, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and their leaders and much of their population carried off into exile. That's where the sermon you'll hear today picks up briefly. During this time, prophetic leadership emerges, critiquing the kings and religious leaders that are allied with them, and calling the people of Israel back to obedience to the law and to care for the poor. And this prophetic tendency gives rise to hopes, not for an earthly leader or government, but for a Messiah. Hopes which will soon fill our music as we enter the season of Advent. The people are returned from exile under a foreign king, Cyrus of Persia. But the people of Israel only have independence and power for a brief period before the birth of Christ as the long-awaited Messiah, whom they by and large reject because they expect or desire the Messiah to be more of a political liberator than the bringer of the eschatological future kingdom that Christ inaugurates. In the New Testament, the development of the role of government is very short and limited because neither Jews nor Christians rule themselves. The Roman Empire is supreme. In various places, it threatens Christians with persecution, official or localized. And it is ultimately this secular government, the Roman Empire, that puts Jesus to death. After the resurrection of Christ, Christianity spreads into the Greco-Roman world, a completely different culture, under the Apostle Paul, and most of its writers urge Christians to be good citizens, essentially to keep their noses clean, so as to be positive examples and to avoid trouble at the hands of the Romans who rule them. Within the New Testament, especially the letters of Paul, there is a developing sense towards the end of Paul's life and the later letters of government as a potential protector in which Christians are urged to submit to because those authorities that exist, quote, are instituted by God. Yet this is balanced in the New Testament by the way it, and therefore the Bible, ends with ambiguity. As Revelation, that popular book which you all read before you go to sleep every night, depicts government as a beast that persecutes God's faithful ones, coming from Satan and bearing Satan's authority. So it's a mixed review at the end. In an exercise entitled Biblical Ambivalence to Government, which any of you all who have taken my classes and bought the course Bible, this is in there. And it's a really good one-page article to read, Biblical Ambivalence to Government. The following conclusions are reached about the Bible's overall view of government. This exercise says the Bible makes a realistic assessment of human government. Government provides protection and stability. It demands support and loyalty. Its gifts are precious enough to seem God-given. Its failures are sufficiently serious to be deemed otherwise. And the ultimate danger that the Bible as a whole presents about government is that it will see itself as supreme, demanding worship and making claims that it is only appropriate for God to make. Hence the class on the Barmen Declaration that you recently had. From these sources and from my lifelong interest in politics, I'm now coming to some, not quite the end, but at least I'm leaving the biblical survey. I have the following personal conclusions about human government. I share them as your pastor for whatever wisdom they might provide our present day. And they basically just come from me living with this book and living with this interest in politics and for all my life and living here for 20 years, which is great. First, the Judeo-Christian heritage formed by this broad approach of both the Old and New Testaments reveals a depth and a wisdom about the human condition, about human limitations, about, therefore, the need for government, about the dangers of government for oppression. The first official government in the Bible is Pharaoh, who rules the enslaved Egyptians, the enslaved Israelis. That's Israelites. That's the first picture of government. About the dangers of government for oppression, for tyranny, or for claims of divinity, and about less than ultimate achievements that governments are normally able to make. Second, if we believe in a God who is active in history and in a world which remains in need of God's activity, it will be inevitable that God will be involved in the messy affairs of humanity, including government and politics. In addition, as God's Son, the incarnate Christ will also be involved in the perils and pitfalls of governance. One reason Christ is crucified is, after all, that many who heard his promise of the coming kingdom of God interpreted him to be a political liberator coming to restore Israel to its former greatness, and greeted him on Palm Sunday with that assumption and hope. When it became clear to them over the next few days that such was not his role, they fell away or turned against him, and ultimately demanded his crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, who ultimately had the legal authority to carry it out. Thus, unless we have what I consider to be an overly spiritualized religion, in which the gods we worship are literally above it all, God will of necessity become involved in government and history, making it impossible to ever detach our faith from either. All of which means that if we believe in a God who is involved in some way in the world, our belief should rightly influence our political choices. Hence, an adult church school class on the topic of an election is appropriate before we all settle in Tuesday night for what will probably be a long evening and perhaps wait of several days or weeks with the increasingly racked nerves to which we have become accustomed when we follow national events. And finally, in the last section, I would like to close with some quotes that I have collected over the years from our tradition that bear on politics. The three that I'm choosing are all from Reinhold Niebuhr, probably the only theologian to ever make the cover of Time magazine. Niebuhr said, "It is the sad duty of politics to establish justice in a sinful world." Niebuhr spoke of, and I give Tom Young the credit for pointing this statement out to me in his first novel. Niebuhr spoke of the immoral elements of all historical successes. And his most famous quote, "Our capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." Of this last quote, having known people who died of what was likely AIDS before the disease was discovered, and others before treatments were developed, having watched over the course of my ministry the shortening and simplifying of surgeries and therefore recoveries, and of the lengthening of life and of its quality for so many. I have to tell you, the surprise of this happened to me when I went to, between Sunday school and early church, I went to visit somebody in the hospital who happened to be a pathologist who had had her gallbladder removed. This was like in 1990. And, I knew gallbladder surgery to be a 6-week recovery from which you didn't get up. And I went in there and she's sitting up in bed and I said, "You had your gallbladder removed?" And she said, "Yeah. And I'm going home this afternoon." I mean, I didn't know that could happen. And, the next week she was in church. I mean, that would have never happened, before that. I mean, just the knee surgeries and all the surgeries that everybody in this room's had, and the recovery is usually so much faster than, what we think. I've just seen that as a minister. I've seen the effort led by President Bush to significantly reduce AIDS in Africa. I've witnessed the relative speed with which we developed and distributed vaccines during COVID. And having both read and experienced the increased safety of food and automobiles, the increased cleanliness of air and waters, and having witnessed the significant redefining of our culture to include the broad opening of schools and colleges, professions, and neighborhoods to people of different racial, ethnic, religious, and sexual backgrounds, I am a great believer in the possibilities that democracy brings when linked with the ever-evolving capitalist economic system that we have and its hope for the future writ large. If we define justice as in some ways including better health care, safer food, cleaner air for our lungs, cleaner water for the sustainability of our lives, equality of opportunity for all people, particularly in terms of education and labor and housing, then I think we can appreciate the degree to which some form of democracy helps bring some measure of flourishing for the human race. And our capacity to withhold, abuse, or corrupt any of these, of which we have plenty of evidence, is a compelling reason for democratic governance. Our capacity for justice indeed makes democracy possible, but our inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. So in terms of what happens on Tuesday, I have no more wisdom than anyone else in the room, and it has been great to know experts who flee from predictions these days. But my thoughts are these. I think it will be close, but decisive only in the sense of revealing once again how divided we are as a nation. I think we have to be prepared to not know who the winner is for several days, if not longer, just like last time. I think we have to be prepared to prevent a repeat of January 6th in anything approaching the scale and intent it had, along with which a day which, along with the assassination of President Kennedy and 9/11, were among the hardest I've personally experienced as one who loves this country. We need to be prepared for the election results to be adjudicated in the courts up until January 20th. We have to be prepared for action in the streets that I hope will be peaceful, but if not, will be contained with a minimum of violence by well-prepared police and security who are committed to protecting the rights of free speech and assembly. And I would hope that neither candidate would support nor incite such violence, and that both would support its lawful containment. I hope, as I said about a month ago at a Rotary address, that we do not face another assassination attempt, particularly one that is successful. I hope that nations which would seek to cause us harm will not do so during what may be a period of instability and uncertainty. Most of all, I hope that both candidates, leaders of the House and Senate, and the Supreme Court justices will exercise their constitutional roles with dignity and wisdom, putting the good of the nation above their own partisan or personal interests. As usual, I think such leadership will need to begin at the top with each candidate. Perhaps most of all, I pray that after this election, we will be on the road to becoming a nation which embodies a verse from Micah that George Washington cited over 50 times. They shall all sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid. Toward this end, there is a wonderful passage from one of our apocryphal books, which I mercifully don't make you read in my Old Testament class, but the book of the Wisdom of Solomon, which is in the Bible, if you bought it, which describes the attitude that I wish for anyone seeking elected or high office, or anyone who seeks to be a leader of anything significant. In this passage, a king is speaking these words: I am mortal like everyone else, a descendant of the first formed child of earth. And in the womb of a mother, I was molded into flesh. Within the period of 10 months, compacted with blood, from the seed of a man and the pleasure of marriage. And when I was born, I began to breathe the common air and fell upon the kindred earth. My first sound was a cry, as is true of all, and I was nursed with care in swaddling clothes. And then the last line: for no king had a different beginning of existence. There is for all one entrance into life and one way out. Thank you for listening.
Amen.
Yeah, we can do questions.
Stay here till, 5 till 11. It'll be a mad rush down. So let's say 10 till. Okay, no. Come on, we got time to talk, folks. Let's talk. Somebody break the ice, please. Judge.
I was struck by a report on NPR this morning with respect to the Electoral College. And they pointed out that the election, because of the Electoral College, could be won by someone with 20% of the popular vote. 20% of the popular vote. There was a movement quite some years ago with Birch Bayh at the head of it, trying hard to get rid of the Electoral College. And he came very close. And this program pointed out that at the end of the day, the thing that put the kibosh on getting rid of the Electoral College was a coalition of liberal, democratic, Jewish, and Black leaders who saw a political advantage to having an electoral college where edge people could make a significant impact on the results of any issue. That for me was a bit of a takedown and an eye-opening. It's as if no matter how bad things are, they can always get worse. Even when you try to get them better, the good people may make them worse, which again is a bit of a come down. But I thought it was worth passing along just in terms of reflecting on the fragility of the system that we are involved with.
I know there's been
And the importance of everybody being involved in calling their friends across the country to get out.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Whit, do you have any wisdom on that? I know you've got some. I'll put you on the spot.
The Electoral College is more than likely not going anywhere.
Sure.
Because it would take the votes of 3/4 of the states to approve it. And the Electoral College exists in part to satisfy the desires of the smaller states during the Constitutional
Right.
Convention. So it's highly unlikely that the smaller states that benefit disproportionately in the Electoral College would ever agree to abandon it. There are, however, ways to ameliorate its effects. 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, apportion their electoral votes by congressional district. It's up to each state on how they want to apportion their electoral votes. And each state could adopt that sort of system, which would then allow Republican votes in California and Democratic votes in Texas to mean more. You could also apportion electoral votes in proportion to the popular vote, which would be an even more direct way to undermine the effects that you're worried about.
Yeah.
But that's up to each of the states. And the problem is that the state legislatures that benefit from the current system would have to be the ones to adopt the apportionment change.
Right.
But it's possible to do that in each state if you have enough pressure within the states to do it.
Okay. And this discussion is, it sort of points out, to me, one of the things I love about our system, but it also frustrates, is that it is complex. I mean, it is we're a complex nation with a complex system and a constitution that some of the provisions were put in for specific reasons, and they're there now, and it's very hard to amend. And, I find that, again, evidence of human beings being less than perfect, but also evidence of why it's just important, as you say, and as all of you all know, to just keep working it, keep in the system, doing the best we can. So, other comments or questions? Yeah, Scott, and then John.
Reinhold Niebuhr seems to be your theological touchstone.
Depends on the subject. Okay. I mean, I wish I knew more about him or had read him more thoroughly. Okay. but I think I have Niebuhrian instincts.
And say more about those, or that we were young once, but we were.
Maggie keeps showing me pictures of, 3 and 4 year old male boys that look, sad and serious, and says, that's what you were like. I don't think I was very young, but I was so glad when I turned 65 because I'd finally caught up to my chronological age, the personality with which I was born. So I think I am sometimes Niebuhr, and friends who read Niebuhr more sometimes help me correct my tendency to take the fall so seriously. I mean, I really do believe that the world changed in Genesis 3 when it became the world in which we live. And I sometimes think my Niebuhrian instincts fall a little bit more on, our tendency to injustice, what can we do about it, rather than it is democracy that makes justice possible. So I think it's a little more connected with my reading the Old Testament. I've read a lot more of the Old Testament than I have of Niebuhr. But, you got to sound intelligent, so you throw somebody in there that's a common name. So, John.
Do you remember in the 60s or the 70s or 80s, going through your memories of politics, churches opening up on election night or the day after because people were so traumatized by whatever candidate?
I don't.
And I'm not talking about if, after RFK's assassination, opening up churches and some of these traumatic moments, but a simple election that we need to have churches open
I don't.
because people are traumatized.
Yeah, I don't. And I'm told that the Sunday after the JFK assassination was the largest church attendance in America. I don't know where I heard that or how valid that is. And I don't remember it. I do remember going home and learning that Jack Ruby had killed Oswald. But I don't.
Election nights.
No,
Yeah.
I don't remember. I don't remember elections being all that, significant or just consuming. And maybe part of that's Washington, but it's not really. It's in the rest of the country too. Until the last, maybe the Hanging Chad's election, but even a couple of them after that weren't like they've been recently. So I don't know. Yes, Roger.
The National Cathedral was open all day on.
Is it?
election day.
That's
Yeah.
That's neat. We are too, but that's just, we're always open. So, right, well, we stay out of the newspaper. So, Jack.
I remember in high school, we had a problem in a class called civics. And we had the United States had just loaned the whole world enough money to pay for all their war indebtedness and such. And someone asked the professor, who's an older guy, said, how are we ever going to pay this back? How are we going to pay this money back? And he said, oh, that's simple. We just borrow more. And that's how that has grown.
Yeah.
It's just like an atomic bomb, that debt that's up there. So many things that are complicated now started out
Pretty
very,
simple.
very
Yeah,
simple.
that's true. That's true. You've got a longer and better memory than I do from the same state, from the same state we grew up in. So, what do y'all think? Come on. Yes, Judy.
One of the things that bothers me, and we talked about it here a couple of weeks ago, is this Christian nationalism stuff. And it seems to me that while the Constitution says, can't establish a particular religion, there does seem to be a movement in the country to try to force one group's religious beliefs on the society as a whole. And that seems to me to be contradictory to our supposed dedication.
Separation,
of
yeah.
church and state.
I've wrestled some with the Christian nationalism, and I think I want to give you an honest answer about. I'd rather just give you an answer about how I feel or respond to that. and this may not be sufficient, or I may need to rethink it a little bit more, but I mean, I grew up as a Presbyterian in a Bible Belt part of the country where everyone around me, you know, in high school and sort of when you're, you know, when you have friends or people that are interested in religion, had a very different religious experience than I had. And it was usually the born again and more fundamentalist type. It was not as politicized then as it is now. And, you know, in the years I've been a minister, I have always, I mean, I was ordained in 1980, and 1980 was when really the mega churches took off. Willow Creek, and I mean, the explosion of the non-denominational mega churches across the countries really began in the early 80s. And along with that has been just the steady decline of mainline churches, of Presbyterian churches and people like me. So I've lived in this world of decline and knowing that I was different. And what that always left me with was just a sort of live and let live attitude. I mean, I've never tried to take on another denomination or another expression of Christianity. You know, and I went to college at University of Arkansas, and there was a law case going on there in the courts of, you know, a family that lived in the mountains and would not take their children for medical care and were prosecuted for that. So I've been, you know, and I mean, I didn't grow up as close to snake handlers as Jack did, but, you know, we knew what they were, you know, so there's always been a lot of Christian expression out there that I've just sort of preferred to do my own thing and hope that people would be attracted to it. There are, you know, there are some, I'm sort of mixed on church state issues. They're not a high priority for me. What I have seen of a lot of the evangelical movement, frankly, not Christian nationalism, and then whatever it is that Christian nationalism is, sometimes I just think it is so shallow theologically. And I know this is snobby, but I just don't want to justify it with taking it on. And it in some ways it is in an entirely different world than I live in, and that may be. I would have to learn a lot more about it, or you know, if there were a person I could sit down with who was a true believer in some of what you're describing that I could have a conversation with, I think I could have some pretty good sort of biblical and theological responses that would to some extent play on their playing field. Because I don't want to be arrogant about it, but I kind of know the Bible pretty well. And there are some arguments in the public sphere that I think are just horrendous. But I would rather, I'd rather do that one-on-one myself. So, I mean, I'm very good friends with Jack Moline, who, spent the last 7 or 8 years of his working life, with the Interfaith Association that did a lot of lawsuits in favor of, separation of church and state. So I know people on both those sides, but.
Larry, for those interested in it, there's a great book by Tim Alberta called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. He is a evangelical Christian himself. He's the son of an evangelical Christian minister, and he delves into some of those issues. Tim Alberta, an elegant writer as well.
Yeah. I guess one other thing I would say, Judy, is I think at the end of the day, concerning elections and politics, every religious voice has a right to be heard, and every religious voice has a right to express its opinions in either theological or non-theological terms. Okay, I mean, but at the end of the day, it is up to people who vote and legislators who legislate and judges who rule to decide on the issue, and I think ultimately put aside whatever religious motivation might be behind it, whether that religion is sick and warped or whether it's wonderful. You know, I think they've got to decide on the issue at hand. And I was going to say something else relative to that, but I just, I think that's the beauty of a democracy. Everybody's got the right to be heard. At the end of the day, we got to vote. A school board's got to vote. A session's got to vote. A city council's got to vote. Zoning commission's got to vote. And, they're going to decide. Part of being in a pluralistic culture is there are all kinds of motivations or reasons for positions that people arise to. And at the end of the day, we decide for better or worse. Deb?
One of the things that Judy's comment brings up for me is the fact that in, I would say, the last 10 years, I have been shocked by the fact that not all Americans share our basic values, and that may just be naivete and, becoming a mature adult, reaching.
In the last 10 years, we finally did, yes.
Exactly. But it does seem to me that I grew up believing that everybody believed or supported the idea of church and separation of church and state, and I no longer believe that's true. I believed that everybody supported the concept of democracy, and I no longer believe that is true. And I believe that at the end of the day, that people like Supreme Court justices who were appointed for life and given this cushy position would do the best for the people. And as well as elected officials, but I was never quite as naive about them as I was about the Supreme Court. And so, like I said, whether it's just coming of age or things have really changed, those are the things that bother me the most.
Yeah. And I would say this, what I said in this talk about, the people at Westminster I know and the public servants I know. I'm just amazed. I wish when I left the Beltway and went out into the country, people would ask me more questions or show more interest. The country, I don't know if you're shaking your head from when you go to mission, it's people just sort of ignore what we're doing here, because I would love to be able to tell, that 99% of the people that work in this city are the hardest working, smartest, most dedicated people I've ever been around. And they really are, of both parties. When I went back to my former congregation, and I was allowed to spoke at a fellowship hour, and I'd only been here about a year. I said, look, don't bash those lawyers and lobbyists. My stewardship campaign would go way down. I just think, and I know I'm naive, but I really am impressed with people. And what I would say to Deb is that I have a really hard time personally with any leader who does not put the interests of the organization that they lead first, whether that is the President of the United States or the Little League Association. And I am appalled at what I think is a decline in what I call honor. I think people, there is nothing wrong with resigning out of honor because you have done something wrong or you're no longer the person that should run an organization. The more, I don't have a lot of the details on this, but I think when you are a leader, your job, your moral responsibility is what is the healthiest for that organization you lead, and not your own rights or your own interests or your own religion or your own prejudices or your own hopes and dreams. But that is not something I see. I see that being a problem in a lot of different areas, but again, not a lot of them that I'm that up close to. So I don't want to convict anybody out of hand. So other questions? Yeah, Clark.
I was raised in a household with electoral politics. My father was a lawyer for many years. I'm from the state, the Keystone State. Do you know what state that is?
It's called the swing state. The entire presidential election occurs in Pennsylvania.
And so, for decades, electoral politics was part and parcel of my life with our family. And my father was a lawyer, but eventually he was elected to a judgeship. And he ultimately became president of the State Trial Judges Association in the state of Pennsylvania. So he had responsibility to work with various judges in various counties. And, I don't know, there are 65 counties in Pennsylvania. But he did not shy away from declaring that he was a follower of Christ, that he was an elder in the First Presbyterian Church of Beaver, Pennsylvania. He would put that on his pamphlets, and that and he was not the worse for it. In fact, many people approached him and said, "We appreciate the fact that you understand the Christian faith, but you also understand the separation of
Good.
church and state too," because he was, as I say, a well-known and highly respected judge.
Good.
And his passage,
Mm,
when the Pharisees heard that he, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees. Remember, the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. And they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Rabbi, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and all the prophets." And that was part and parcel of one of my father's thoughts. You shall love your neighbor
yeah,
as yourself. And he was unapologetic relative to being a Christian judge.
good. Thank you for sharing. Let me do one other. Okay. John, you've had your hand up and I realized I didn't call on you.
My comment really has to do with the separation of polarization,
Yeah,
of which most of it is done by the media. But when you look at what has happened with all these disasters, all the hurricanes, earthquakes, people are not Republicans or Democrats. They are neighbors helping each other.
yeah,
They totally put all of this stuff behind them. So somebody from the New York Avenue Presbyterian on their speaker series said, "We put politics in a box up here, and as long as you stay out of the box, you can do anything. But once you're in the
Yeah.
box, you say anything to anyone."
yeah. Thank you. Scott,
Larry,
thank you.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.